which will force you to think in an imaginative way, specifically in education. The idea is that each one will show you certain specific mechanisms which will help you to take what you already know about education as a specialist, kind of being a doctoral group mostly. I would work with a specialist line and try and show you different ways you can work with what you already know and produce something new or something imaginative. And I'm going to try and give you the very kind of kernel of it. And what I'd want you to do as we go through it is listen yourselves for how it's going to force you to think in ways which just break you out into different spaces. Now, the first technique works with a combinatorial logic, okay, to produce new options. Now, at its simplest, let's take one variable with two possible states. So let's take, for example, selection of knowledge and define two possible states. Open, let's see if this works, green, yeah. Selection, open, or solid. There's the variable, selection. There's the possible states it can be in. Now, by solid, let's define it. By solid, we mean only one selection is legitimate. By open, we mean many possible selections are possible. Okay, so just hold on to that. Either one definite selection or the possibility of many open selections. Now, all this device does is adds variables on, okay, and states. And the instruction is when you add a variable and a state, you have to remember the previous one. So you have to add it on to the previous one. So let's see this by adding on a variable. Okay, there we have selection, open and solid. And now what we'll do is we'll add one on. Okay, and there you can see what we've done is we've taken selection, we've added sequencing. So now you have a situation where you have selection, open or solid, sequencing, open or solid, and what that does now is it produces four possibilities, four possible spaces. Firstly, you have selection, open, open. That's one possibility. Second one, open with selection, solid sequence. Okay. Third one, solid selection, open sequence. Fourth one, solid selection, solid sequence. Right? Now, it gives us four possible spaces. Now, what we can do, hold on to it, and let's add another variable on. Okay? And now you can see all that's happening is each time what we're trying to do is we're trying to add a variable and its state. Now, what's interesting about this is notice this little thing over here, right? How it's working is it's working where the possible states give you 2, and the power is the variable. So 2 to the power of 3, and we can work that out. Okay, we've got 2 states, 3 variables. 2 times 2 times 2 gives us 8. Now hold on to that, okay? Because we're going to be in a situation where it kind of works more strongly than that. Now, the power of this device derives from its careful choice of variables and states. The pedagogic act itself must work with selection, sequencing, and pacing, okay? But we could add more variables, okay? What of assessment? What about the relationship between the teacher and the student? Right, so now we're working with 5 variables, okay? Selection, sequencing, pacing, assessment, relationship. Still working with 2 states, open or solid. You know what that is now. You take 2 states, times it by the number of variables each time, 2 times 2 times 2, 2 to the power of 5, 32 possibility spaces. And you'll see how we work with that afterwards, okay? It's also possible to imagine more than 2 states. Now, this is a crucial move. We could start with a completely solid selection, and then we could say that instead of just having solid and open, we have solid, solid moving to open, open, open moving to solid. Now we're working with 4 states, okay? If you're working with 4 states, Now what do you have? You have 4 states, 3 variables, that gives you 64 possibility spaces. And of course, you keep on going, and you could have a situation where you have 5 variables, 4 states, and that gives you 1,024 possibility spaces. Now, clearly that becomes difficult for your imaginations to hold, okay? And of course, we're in a situation where I want to show you how it actually works. So what we're going to do is we're going to move into a situation where this instrument of thought is going to force you to think about the variations of pedagogic life. And imagine spaces you haven't thought about carefully before. We tend to get stuck in extremes, either completely open or completely solid, and we don't imagine the varieties that there can be in between. Okay? So now let's kind of force our imaginations to follow where the device insists we go. Okay? Now we already know the task that awaits us if we have 3 variables, 2 states. It's 2 to the power 3. We know we're working with 8 spaces. So let's start with the first one. Okay? There you have a situation where you're working with solid selection, solid sequencing, solid pacing. Okay, now just start to think about that quickly and try to hold on to it. Now in South Africa, we have the chorus model. Okay? Only 1 selection is allowed, only 1 sequence is allowed, and only 1 pace is allowed. Right? The teacher works with the class in that kind of very directed way, says something, the class says it back in unison. There's only 1 pace. There's only 1 selection, the teacher makes it. There's only 1 sequence, the teacher decides. Now, it strikes me as quite curious that we haven't worked on improving that model of pedagogy. That we've kind of jumped to the opposite extreme, which we'll see later. That we haven't asked ourselves, where are types of pedagogy like that, which do this kind of a style, but kind of almost like on pedagogic steroids, as it were, you know, kind of really push the limit of it. Now, you get direct instruction, which is such a bad word across kind of most of the world. It's developed by a guy called Engelman in the USA. Now, it's like the chorus model, okay? Enormous care is taken by selecting exactly the right knowledge, micro-sequencing every step with a small little jump in inference, but each small little jump is a logical jump, which the kids can see, okay? And what happens is the teacher is working in a situation where the teacher has to work the sequence which is given by Engelman, because Engelman has perfected it. He spent years kind of trying to work out for himself what is the best set of micro moves to make. And then what the teacher does is the teacher makes the move, the kids have to respond in unison. They all have to put their hands up, or they all have to do something. It's either an action or a question. Each one is micro, each one is quick, around 10 responses a minute. Now that interests me. That's very close to the chorus model. Okay? And we can see its trajectory is very much the same as the chorus model. So what your imagination starts to do is your imagination starts to be able to go, okay, here are 2 versions of a similar kind of a code, but the one kind of works in a fairly limited way, and the other is highly sophisticated. And instead of trying to locate the move from this to a radically open model, you locate the move within something and then see if you can move it along in terms of its sophistication. Now that's what this model does. Let's move on to the second one. Okay, the second possible pedagogic space allows choice and selection, but once you've made your own selection, it has to be paced and it has to be sequenced in a certain way. Now, certain forms of the PhD cohort system work with this. Okay, I don't know if Kelly's here. There's Kelly. Kind of like when Kelly was in KZN, it was kind of like this kind of model was the model which was worked with to some extent. Where what you do is you allow the students some choice over selection, but then what happens is you sequence and pace it rigorously. Except with Kelly's group, often what would happen is she'd also strengthen the selection line. In other words, she'd say, this is what you buggers are doing in the doctorate, okay? This is how you have to do it, this is when you have to do it, and there it is. And people chase through it. So, move on to the next one. You could have a situation where, for example, this is another PhD cohort model, where you do allow freedom in selection, and I suspect this is more this model over here. You're allowed to choose what you want to do, and also you're allowed to pace it. There's fairly open pacing requirements. But there are kind of requirements that you do it in a certain order, that you have to produce things in a certain ordered way which produces the doctorate at the end. Now, the fourth possible space allows both the open selection and the open sequence, but then tightens the pacing. That's an interesting model, okay? That's project by deadlines. What you do is you have a situation where you say, look, you choose what you want to do. And you can do it how you want to do, but your buggers better have it done by this and this and this and this time, okay? So you can see how they're working with the variation of the lines. Now, the fifth possible space, well, that's a radically open space, okay? It's diametrically opposed to the direct instruction model. And in this model, what you do is you hope by opening it out in a radically free way that children or adults will land up in a situation where they become critically responsible for their own learning, and they explore it in a space where in that openness they can be creative and kind of self-regulate. The sixth possible space, this is one of my favorites. It's the Khan Academy. And I don't know if any of you have actually got onto the Khan Academy and checked out what's going there. Okay, it's a dude who's put 4,000 videos on the internet, okay, in maths and science and a couple of other areas. And what happens is you can basically learn maths from grade 1 through to the end of calculus through his system. And what he's done is he's tightened the selection line. In other words, there's 4,000 videos. Not any choice in what's there. But it's up to you, once you're in there, what sequence you take. And it's up to you in there what pace you do it, because you're doing it at home. Right? Now, these dudes are becoming so sophisticated now. What happens is if you go there, you can do tests at the beginning. So you do a test, they work out where you are. And then what happens is they're now starting to strengthen the sequencing line. In other words, once you've done the test, they will say to you, out of the 4,000 videos, you do these ones over here. And at the end of each of those ones, you do a test. And depending on the test, they then say to you, do this one, or do that one. So you have a tightened sequence line, but it's independent for every single individual on this planet. The seventh one, or the sixth one, sorry, that's the sixth one, yes, problem solving, or the seventh one, is a very interesting one. It kind of goes on in Japan quite a lot. And what happens there is they give you a very strong selection line. They say, this is what you have to learn. And then on top of that, they make the pacing strong. You have to do it in this amount of time. But then they say, we don't know how you're going to get with what you've got to the end point. You go and try and work it out. So the sequence is left open. And then they have to explore within that very limited time and that limited choice, they have to work out what the answer is. So you have this very dynamic, creative model. And finally, you have the eighth kind of version of this, which is what Lisa was talking about last night. And that is one of the models which the Bernsteinians have worked with quite powerfully, especially for working class kids. And that's a situation where you make the selection of knowledge very clear, and you make the sequence of knowledge very clear, but you give the learners time to actually master it in their own time so that they can actually get a sense of what it is. And that's especially important for hierarchical subjects. But what I want you to do, we're working, and as Lisa said last night, she said, it's a great theory because it tells you something. Now, instead of working with theory today, I'm going to be working with the imagination. So I'm going to be trying to blow it open and say, well, what are the possibilities? Bearing in mind that some of them work better than others in certain contexts. So what you have now is you have a situation where we can kind of treasure the possibilities. And what this device does, okay, is it forces your pedagogic imagination to work with what the possibilities are by forcing you to say, what are the variables, what are the states, and if it's there, what can it be? I didn't know that the Japanese model was there. I sat with it. I sat with it and I went, geez, what could that be? Okay. because the device was telling me that that was a possible space. And then I had to try and imagine what it was. Okay? Now, what are you doing with there? You're working with a situation where you're working with that basic mathematical equation. You're working with a situation where you're saying you have S equaling the number of states, N equaling the number of variables, and it's states to the power of variables. And that gives you the first kind of space. Now, with this one demonstration behind us, we can define the object of focus better. Okay, I can try and define for you what I'm going to try and do in this keynote. By devices of the pedagogic imagination, I mean instruments of thought that enable a rigorous breaking through into pedagogic possibilities not initially visualized by an educational specialist. Not someone who's naive. This doesn't work for someone who's naive. You need a certain background of education to be able to do this. Let's be clear on it. It's not just a generic device. Okay? You need to already be skilled up in education. Now, device is purposefully chosen. The 4 instruments described in this address each have a specific rule-governed way of functioning that produce, when artfully used, an inventive effect. Held together, and this is where I hope it's going to get interesting, held together they're going to open up for inner play, the mother of all devices, okay, the pedagogic device, right? And that's a lot of device to have in one address. Okay, so let's see how it goes as we move through it. Now, the second device of the pedagogic imagination works with levels. Now, at its heart lies the modest request to take whatever pedagogic process or object is your focus, and then you ask, what are the levels below and the levels above it? Okay? Now, you name the level that you're on as level 0, or the coordinate level. You name the level above as level +1, or the superordinate level, and the level below as level -1, or the subordinate level. Okay? Now, you're in a situation where you're going to ask yourself, how many levels can you go up or down? But with one requirement: you're not allowed to lose your pedagogic focus. At a certain stage, what happens is, as you move down levels, it shifts away from education into something else. It shifts into neurons, for example. Okay? And you land up in a situation where you lose the pedagogic purchase. That's where you stop. Same thing as you go higher. At a certain point, you're going to break through into levels which aren't education. That's where you stop. It's not that you don't look beyond those levels. It's that you have to recognize what that boundary is. Okay? So, Plato used this device, okay, in his cave metaphor, where a pilgrim travels from the cave of shadows into the light of abstract ideas. And he travels through the levels, okay, through fire, up into the sunlight, into the good. And for Plato, what that was it's a shift from a concrete world where you're stuck in concrete world, and you shift into the abstract world of mathematics, and then eventually into the idea of the principles of the good. They used this device, right? Piaget told the story of our cognitive development, from sensory motor through to pre-operational, to concrete operational, to formal operational. It's a climbing device. Okay? Yeah, we have Maslow. It's a hierarchy of needs. Similar idea, climbing up and down. Interestingly, with Maslow, right at the end of his life, and this can happen to you, you break through into another level. So Maslow, just before he died, started to get into self-transcendence. Okay? He started to point to the fact that there's a world beyond self-actualization. Kind of broke through over there. You have Bronfenbrenner. Then now you have a more spatial model. And it's quite interesting. It's shifting from concrete to abstract. Now you're moving from micro to meso to exo to macro. And with Bronfenbrenner, never forget that he always added that in time. Okay, it shifts in time. You have chrono. Okay, Bloom gave us a taxonomy of learning domains: remembering, understanding, evaluating, creating. And then, of course, we have Bernstein. Bernstein in the pedagogic device takes us from the esoteric all the way down into the everyday production of knowledge in the, reproduction of knowledge in the classroom. Now, like this combinatorial device, the climbing device is deceptively simple. It can be used in very different terrains that range over spatial, social, political, psychological, instructional, organizational domains. Sometimes the logic goes from small to big. Sometimes the logic goes from concrete to abstract. Sometimes the logic goes from simple to complex. Okay? Now, let's give a couple of examples. Okay? Now, the first example I want to give is an example from direct instruction, from this dude, Engelman. Now, what he does there is he will always ask himself, he will land up in a situation where he'll take a micro little bit of a lesson, and then he'll say to himself, if I make a move, what do I do? Do I move one step up? Do I move one step down to consolidate? Or do I move across and give an example which is similar? Or an example which is different? Never forget that if you're working on a coordinate level, what you're doing is you have to generate similarity and difference. Okay, that's how kids get it, right? And then what he does is he works with that logic to produce a lesson. Now, the lesson doesn't just go in a step upwards. Now, you know this from kind of working with Maton. You know this from Maton. Okay, you've got the kind of wave story, okay, which goes up and down. So Maton is talking about this to some extent, the climbing device, and he's showing how the climbing device, when you work it, goes a little bit up, a little bit down, a little bit up, a little bit down. But never forget that what Maton is working with is just one version of what has been talked about for thousands of years. Okay? But it's not only inside the lesson that you have this climbing device, okay? It can also be used on the material dimensions of school. So now let's take the physical structure of a school as our object of focus. Okay, so now imagine the school. Okay, now go down levels. You go from a school, what's the next lowest level? Classroom. What's in a classroom? Desks and chairs. What's on desks and chairs? Books and equipment. Okay, writing equipment. Okay, so let's look at that. But now let's hold time at the same time. 100 years ago, they were using a slate tablet. Look what we're using now. Okay, this is the new one that's kind of going through. If we move on, you can see they used to have the kind of old wooden desks. Right now we have this beautiful kind of polypropylene chair, okay, which is amazing. It's 2.5 kilograms of plastic. Takes you about 70 seconds to make, right? It's inexpensive, it's lightweight, it's washable, it's weatherproof, it's stackable. It's great for landfalls because they break so easily, where they don't biodegrade, and at the same time millions more are being popped out every day, That's progress for you. You combine it with the trapezoid table, and you get this wonderful version of modern kind of classroom furniture, which is, we work with kind of the group work kind of style. Now, a far more regimented set of pedagogic practices were afforded by the older desks. Right? And you can see with the older desks, what happened was they had this military precision where you were kind of taught how to work. They'd say, there was the instruction, stand, and you'd all stand, and there'd be out, and you'd all step out, and you'd walk down the aisles, okay? And a lot of the design of these desks had to do with issues to do with standing and sitting, and with where you'd put the slate, and if you could show the slate. But what you've got to bear in mind is that you don't even have desks often. You had long benches. And it's quite interesting when you see the Lancastrian model. Okay, there you can see a long bench. So the kid would sit on a long bench, and that wouldn't even be a teacher. Okay, that would be a kid, right? And I'll talk to that now. Now, classrooms. You said classrooms. But you go back in time, you didn't have classrooms in England often. What you did was you had schoolrooms, okay? And the learners of various ages were sorted in rows. Okay, and there you can see it, right? This is a schoolroom, it's not a classroom. And all the kids from all the different ages would be assorted in ability levels, not age levels. Right? And they'd sit over here. This would be level 1. Okay? And then they'd move once they got to level 2, to level 3, to level 4, all the way to level 8. Okay? So you don't have classrooms. You have schoolrooms. And it kind of makes it strange for us, because most of us experience school in the physical space of a classroom. We divide it up and separate it into age groups. And this wasn't obvious. This wasn't the obvious way to organize schooling in 19th century England. Nor is it the obvious way to do it now, by the way. The classroom mode is just going quickly. It's almost out. When the English architect Robson, he's a very interesting dude, in the 1870s, he went traveling around the world, the Western world, okay, to kind of check out what was going on with all the different architectural styles of all the schools. And he arrived in 1870s, arrived in Prussia, and he writes in his great book on the architectural styles, he writes this. He's very excited in this thing, and he notes, the system in use amongst the whole German-speaking race turned on the theory that each class should be taught in a separate room by a separate and fully qualified master. Jeez, imagine that. How strange is that? And what delight for the pedagogic imagination to find what it thought an obvious level to be missing. And to find how implicated the physical equipment is in the pedagogic practice. Now, let's keep on moving, okay? So now we've kind of moved up to the school level. What happens when we widen our focus from parts inside a school to the many schools around the world? Well, take Carter High School. It's directly below my house. 36 cars, parked nice and neatly, tarred road, extensive parking bays, easy access, wide pavements, lots of trees, lots of shrubs, green fields, roll outwards. You've got the beautiful swimming pool, which I swim in, and you've got the tennis court, which I play on. And then as the world slowly spins on its axis, we could take pictures of other schools. So we're now working on the coordinate level. We're staying with schools, but now we're moving to other schools. In Pande High, the differences of palpable. Okay? No tennis courts, there's no rolling fields. The cars are parked haphazardly. If you had to kind of take it in time, you'd see that the cars come and go. At Carter High School, once the cars are there, they stay. Pande High, they come and go. If you take a look at the kids coming into the school, you'd see that the kids come in a rush at Carter, and then at a certain stage they leave, and Carter stays busy until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Take a look at it over here. Okay, there's people arriving 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, and people leaving 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. Now, how amazing would it be to take as your unit of analysis all the schools of the world? I mean, what astonishing patterns would you find? And what terrible, terrible nightmares would you actually dream? Because there's so many more of those schools than the Carter schools in the world. Now, if the first device works with combining pedagogic variables and states, so hold on to that, hey? The first device works with variable states, and the second device works by taking two different elements. It works with climbing. The second device works with climbing through levels. The third works by taking two different elements and then working them in a transformation that brings a new blend from their mixture. Now, this is the fundamental act of the pedagogic imagination. You take two different topics or concepts or ideas and you integrate them in a way that produces something transformed and illuminating. Now, in South Africa, we're currently waking up from a bit of a kind of integration hangover. Okay, we suffered a bit. I think we imbibed too much of the integration juice. Okay, especially with outcomes-based education. But overindulgence should never be an excuse for not doing it. Okay, let's be clear on that, right? It's a fundamental act of the pedagogic imagination. And again, it's going to force you. I'm going to try to show you how this tool forces you. Just like you were forced by the variable and the state to imagine new spaces. And just like you were forced by the climbing device to go up and down. This one is going to show you how you get forced to integrate. Okay? Now what you can see over here is you have a situation where you have two topics. And what you have to do is you have to start a cross-space mapping. You have to say to yourself, what is similar? What can I associate? And what can I not associate? Now again, it has to be an expert that does this. It has to be a person who's good in their field, because you have to recognize what relates and you have to recognize what's not relevant. Okay? So you've got to be quite careful about how you kind of work it. Okay? And this kind of, at its most elementary level, you have two separate input spaces along with the cross-space mappings. Okay? Now let's use an example again. I think you have to have an example to kind of work this story through. This is one of my favorite examples. I found this transparency on a kind of, was thrown away in one of the kind of classroom visits I went to. And I thought it was just stunning, you know. It's a pictorial description of the changes of the Industrial Revolution. And what you have is you have a before and after. And let's go to the first one, okay? Now here you can see the first picture. Now you've literally got two inputs. Remember I said two inputs? Okay, on the one side you've got farming, on the other side you've got industry. Now just take a look at it for a second and start to look for cross-space mappings, okay? Think about it, okay? What do you have? What do you have there? Bird. No birds there. This dude's smiling. What's this dude? Not smiling. Okay? This dude's got a breast. That dude's got a penis. No. Okay, so you find something which isn't there, right? So you go, no, not that. Okay? Although grade 10 boys would say something like that. Over here you have a plow. Over there you have a machine. Right? Now what you start to do is you start to work that. Now notice that as soon as you do that, you're generating a third space. Okay? You're generating a situation where after you do the cross-space mapping, there it is. Okay? You've done it across plow, machine, farming industry, no penis, breast story, but all the rest kind of holds. Right? Now when you do that, what are you actually doing? Well, you have to have found something that they hold, and that's a generic space. Okay? It's a more abstract space, but it doesn't tell you very much. Right? Bird's a machine, that's environment. Smile, no smile, that's an emotion. Outside, inside, that's got to do with space. Okay? But you need to kind of find some kind of correlation which it works. But the space where the integration actually does its work is in the fourth space. Okay? And that's the space where you land up in a situation where you shift, okay, into a blended space. Where you're not just talking about the environment, you're actually talking about the difference between something being natural and artificial. And you're not just talking about emotion, you're talking about discontent of the working class. Okay? It takes a skilled teacher to do that. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show you the mechanism which forces you to do it. You take those two inputs and you start the work. You go, what are the mappings? What's the generic space? How can I play with it? Okay? Now, yeah, I find these kinds of artifacts amazing. But it's doing something else. Okay? It's doing something else which is crucial. Okay, Carol? No, yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm kind of freebasing. Now, there's a lot of simplified information working in that picture. Right? Now let's take a look at what's actually been done. Okay? Firstly, it's taken the whole time period. 1750 to 1900. So I'm getting a bit dizzy. Okay? It's juxtaposed it into one moment. It's compressed it. It's taken space, rural to urban. It's compressed it into one picture, which is actually the same picture. It's topologically similar. Right? Change, shift over centuries, simplify. Identity, farmers and workers, reduced to two figures. Cause effect, before after juxtaposition. It's taking the complexity and reducing it, compressing it, simplifying it into a shape which has human kind of ability, comprehension. It's too much to take in, so what you do is you work this transformative logic to kind of produce a more simplified kind of version of it. Okay? Now, I mean, just think about it. The picture's working with time, space, change, identity, cause effect, part whole, compressing massively complex events and sequences into a digestible little portion of elegant simplicity. Now, to fully realize the magnitude of the transformation, read any cutting-edge journal article. on the Industrial Revolution. Absorb the complexity of its language, the nuance of its distinctions, the massive amount of assumed knowledge that you need, the continual reference, and then juxtapose it to the simple picture. Okay? And what you're beginning to do is you're beginning to get a sense of this pedagogic device that we talked about initially. You're beginning to get a sense of so many transformations that have happened, right? To take knowledge from the esoteric heights where it's produced all the way down to this beautiful little piece, okay, found on an overhead transparency in a classroom, tossed away. Now, at this point, we can begin to glimpse how the three devices of the pedagogic imagination give us some insight into the inner workings of the pedagogic device. Now, you already know what the pedagogic device is. It's precisely what I've described. Okay? The pedagogic device is what takes esoteric knowledge and transforms it into a process where it's actually understandable in the classroom. Right? That's what it is. So you kind of already got it, right? So now you have a situation where you've got level 1. Okay, that's the production of knowledge, generation of knowledge. Then you go down to level 2, where it's recontextualized. Okay? And when it's recontextualized, you have a situation that then gets into the classroom. Notice, oh, we're working with levels, are we? Oh, so it's the climbing device. Oh, so it wasn't only the transformative, it's also the climbing device. Okay? Notice also that what Bernstein's done with that is worked with the key borderlands. He's worked with where the device runs out of its pedagogy, where it hits the borderland, like the primary contextualizing context of the family, okay, and the community, which forms the ground from which the pedagogic device takes its subjects. What about the field of the economy? What about symbolic control? What about the international field? Okay, that strongly influences the device. So it's a hierarchical device, it's a climbing device. Okay? Now, work the pedagogic imagination through the levels now. Okay, that's what I want to show you. Start at the highest point, the international field. Now notice that we have the most widespread, okay, and then, no, it's fine. And then what happens is we go down a level, and we go down a level into a situation where we go into the official recontextualizing field, which is the Department of Education. The Department of Education has to take the esoteric knowledge, and it has to turn it into a curriculum. And we, in the universities, have to produce the teachers in the pedagogic recontextualizing field that can actually teach this stuff. Okay? And then you have a situation where it goes down to its lowest level, where you have the classroom, where you have the pedagogic code with its teachers and its learners. Okay? Now, but notice what happened as we did that. Were we going from macro to micro? We were going from the international field, which is big, down into the classroom, which is kind of quite small. But weren't we also going from abstract to concrete? Weren't we also going from complex to simple? So what you begin to get a sense of is that as you start, your imagination start to grow, as your pedagogic imagination strengthens, you start to attend to the different kinds of climbing levels that you have to go through. Okay? How am I doing for time? Have I got 20 minutes? Okay. I might need 30 minutes, 25 minutes. My apologies. Instead of rushing through it, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take it a little bit more slowly and kind of run through it. Okay, now, but secondly, note that it's not only levels that the pedagogic device is working with. How is it possible, here's the question, how is it possible to learn what has taken the accumulated labor of the brightest of our human species thousands of years to work out? And we're producing new knowledge all the time. How can we condense that into 12 years of learning? Well, we know that hindsight helps a bit. Okay? It took us a long time to work out numbers and took us a long time to work out letters. Now we do it in grade 1 and grade 2. Right? Now, from the solar system to the atom. Right? Solar system, from the biggest to the smallest. Notice I'm working the imagination. Okay, I'm trying to work it. From the biggest to the smallest, we've worked out how to teach this to our kids. But you know what we've even done, which is amazing? We even use the biggest, the solar system, to teach our kids about the smallest, the atoms. So we have the planetary model of the atom. Okay? And this is what the pedagogic device is. That's what it is at its heart. It's a transformative tool, okay, of enormous power that continually works at blending things together and reducing them to a human scale so that you can understand what's going on. Thirdly, okay, so we've checked out. We've checked out that the pedagogic device is a climbing device, and we've seen that it's a transformative device. Thirdly, you note that we have pedagogic discourse kind of running through the device. Now, there it is. Right? Now, at its simplest, pedagogic discourse consists of manipulating the states of key variables of pedagogy. But now, hold on. That's what we spent the first quarter of this presentation doing. So all that pedagogic discourse means is it means taking the key variables of pedagogy and trying to work out what possible states they could be in. And what we did was we worked with 8 possible states. Okay? Now with Bernstein, he doesn't work with 3 variables. He doesn't just work with selection, sequencing, and pacing. He actually works with kind of around 5 framing variables and kind of 3 classification variables, although it's more complex than that. But that gives us 8 variables. And he works with 2 states. He works with strong and weak. So work the equation. How many possible spaces are there with Bernstein? 2 to the power of 8. 4, 1, 2, 250. 256 possible spaces in Bernstein. And that's at its simplest, eh? Bernstein works with far more spaces than that. But you can get that. Right? Now step back for a second. Sorry, Carol, we're there. Yeah. And kind of just contemplate the beauty of this. Contemplate how the 3 devices of the pedagogic imagination, combining variables and states, climbing levels, and transforming knowledge into digestible portions, they come together in a systematic vision of the pedagogic device. Now, only for a second kind of get blown away by that. I certainly am blown away by it, because we've left something crucial out. The key device of the pedagogic imagination that bears down on the other 3 with a structuring force. It's caught by Bernstein in the GRD, or what he calls the general regulative discourse, okay, by which he means the dominant values of society that provide the deep guiding principles informing how we instruct. Now, how we teach is embedded deeply in the values we live by, right? We want to produce certain kinds of children. We want to produce certain kinds of adults. And this is caught by Bernstein in a formula which he gives, which is kind of like the instructional discourse, which is pedagogy, is embedded deeply within regulative discourse, which are the principles by which and the values by which we live by. Now, I want to illustrate this again, okay? I want to illustrate how profoundly important this regulative zone actually is by a negative kind of parable. And this is the failure of direct instruction in the USA. It's a really interesting story. Right now, I told you about direct instruction, and you've got a sense of it. But the key sense I want you to get of it is it's not just rote learning. People tend to immediately assume that it's rote learning. It's a very responsive situation where the teacher's always asking something and everyone's always responding quickly. So it's very dynamic. But it is completely scripted. Right? The person's worked out exactly what moves work, and they've tested it. So they've tested it for years. They've tested it on class after class. And if the kids don't get it, or if half the kids don't get it, they go back and say, what have we done wrong? And they rework it until they... Now, teachers haven't got enough time to do that. Right? Now, what happened was in America, they had a situation where they had a project called Project Follow-Through. Now, Project Follow-Through, you really must go look it up, was one of the largest and most expensive experiments in education ever conducted by the USA government. Right? It was done in the 1970s and the 80s. What they did was they had an open hunting season. They said, we don't care what your pedagogy is. We don't care what your innovations are. You go find a couple of classes, you get a situation where you show what the class is already doing, you then do your intervention, and then you show what the improvements are. But we will come and we will study this properly with you, and we will check it out. Okay, so it'll be scientific. Now, old Engelmann participated in this. Okay? And what happened was, he won hands down. Okay? He won hands down. Math, spelling, language, right? Didn't matter whether it had to do with kind of situations where you were working with basic skills, cognitive skills, effectiveness. There's direct instruction. Okay? Now that line over there is not the baseline. That's the line of the average improvement. So you've got to bear in mind that no matter what you do, you will always improve. Okay? Never look at a system when it improves and say, wow, that's fantastic. You've got to ask how much it improves. Right? Here's the average improvement. That's 0. Across all the ones, that's how much on average the interventions improved. Direct instruction was that much above it. Right? Over here, we have open education. That's, in terms of the pedagogic variables, that was open selection, open sequencing, open pacing. It's quite interesting that they're kind of on opposite sides, and this one's doing so well and this one's doing so badly. Right? It's like weird, very weird. Now, Engelmann, when this happened, okay, he was ecstatic. He thought that he was going to become the top kind of guru of education in America. Right? The results were, I mean, once this came out, all the kind of liberal universities kind of then interrogated the results and tried to tear it to shreds. But the point is, and here the point is key, is that, and let me just get to the point. The point is that it went against the most deeply held values of American life. Okay? American life is about freedom, choice, individualism. Direct instruction goes precisely against those deeply held values. Didn't matter that it was performing over there. Didn't stand a chance. Because the values embedded in direct instruction, the regulative discourse of direct instruction, just completely goes against the deep principles which inform American life. And never forget that, okay? Never forget that the pedagogy you work with will always have to take account. Its deepest resource is the regulative. Now, this provides us with some reasons why direct instruction hasn't become one of the dominant pedagogic discourses in the USA. But what about South Africa? Now, over here we have more traditional practices, especially in our more traditional areas. A guy by the name of Guthrie, he's quite a controversial dude, but he's an interesting guy, Gerald Guthrie. He's pointed out that African cultures, which have a more revelatory epistemology, okay, where the ancestors and the elders kind of tell you what's going on and you have to accept what they say, where you deeply respect your elders, and they would have a far stronger respect for more traditional or solid forms of pedagogy. Now, isn't there some resonance there between the regulative world of that kind of traditional set of values and more direct forms of instruction? Why have we not experimented more with versions of direct instruction and jumped straight into a situation where we've tried to not only give a completely different pedagogy, radically open, but a pedagogy which holds deep within inside itself principles which people from a more traditional background just don't get, don't like, don't want. But now we cannot allow our pedagogic imaginations to just get stuck between one or two regulative discourses, just as we cannot allow ourselves to imagine only two instructional discourses. There's more than one set of guiding principles in education. Just as we have learned to work with different instructional combinations, you've also got to learn how to work with different regulative combinations. Now, to some extent, we already learn this as a part of growing up. As children, we are immersed in a world we simply accept. As teenagers, we kind of separate ourselves from the world, we rebel from it. but we don't really understand what else is on offer. Okay, it's kind of like we rebel, but we don't know what for. But as adults, we come to a working understanding of the different regulative principles, and we work between their different ethical demands, depending on the situation at hand. Now, when a dispute arises over a key education issue, it's often almost impossible to just talk about the evidence. Because the problem is different regulative orders, different ethical value worlds respect different kinds of evidence. So you'll end up in a situation where in a dispute over a pedagogic issue, we have to search for some common ground, some kind of compromise, some kind of test of worthiness that we can both agree on. And we have to do this in a space where our highest ordering principles are actually inconsistent. And as I was saying to Lisa last night, when your highest ordering principles are inconsistent, you can't find a higher principle. It's your highest principle which is inconsistent. You then have to find a compromise. You have to find something which you both fudge, okay, which you kind of can both work with. And it is here in the space of dispute between two ethically informed peers, each of whom feels deeply that their own regulative principle is best, but at the same time they both still search for some kind of space where they can work together, that the pedagogic imagination is needed. Okay? Justifications and critiques must be conducted in a diplomatic way that negotiate between competing principles. Now, I choose this adverb diplomatic very carefully because you're working in dangerous terrain. The principles that inform what we do, they're precious to us. By definition, they tend to have a universalizing kind of impetus. If you believe, for example, that being creative in education is important, okay, you'll tend to believe that all children have creative energies, right? You'll tend to believe that creativity is vital for pedagogy, but even more than that, you'll kind of push it. You'll say that creativity is important for all of us. It makes the world a better place. If you lose creativity, you lose on a better world. That's good for everyone. Now, when such a set of principles clash with a more traditional set of principles which have to do with order and routine and respect and tradition, the disgust and horror felt by each for the other, okay, is astonishing, right? You feel that you're harming the very essence of the learner. And more than that, you feel like you're actually damaging the possibility of a better world. And certainly when I present on direct instruction, just in terms of its own terms, afterwards, I'll have people come to me in such anger, okay? And they can't express why normally. It's just a fury. They feel like I've attacked them in the heart. They feel like I've taken a dagger and I've just been stabbing them for like about half an hour. Now, so what you've got to try to do now is you've got to try to get to a space where you, using your imagination, try to imagine what it would be like to negotiate between these different ethical worlds. Take, for example, generic skills, which again was talked about last night. The generic dudes are arguing for generic skills. They're committed to it, hey? They're not just like, oh, we need generic skills because, you know, it's kind of the latest fashion. That's not the way they talk, okay? For them, the market is changing very quickly. New technologies and innovations, okay, are making rich old traditions and specialized skills, they're making them obsolete quickly, right? How can we not prepare our children for a world of work, they will say? How can we not square up to a world of flexibility and adaptability, which is going to be key to our children's futures? How can we not make generic skills the informing principle of how we actually teach? And they will feel very, very strongly about that, because it's the future world, a better world for their kids, which is at stake. So now, how does this world of competing regulative principles become a device of the pedagogic imagination? Let's go back to the definition at the beginning. The device must have a specific, rule-governed way of functioning, which produces, when artfully used, an inventive effect. So now it's in how these different regulative principles come into dialogue with each other, that the pedagogic imagination begins to play. So now let's try and do it. Okay, so just try to stick with me as we get to the end, because we're kind of pushing now right to the end, and I suspect you might be kind of flagging at this point. Certainly when I did this in Peter Maritzburg, at about this point people were going, enough's enough, you know. So let's take three regulative principles. Just like before, we took three instructional variables. We took selection, sequencing, pacing. Now let's take three regulative principles. Let's take creativity. Let's take traditional kind of principles, and let's take generic skills. Okay, so we've got three, and let's name two states. Okay, either they're in alliance with each other, or they're in conflict with each other. Okay, so now let's take that. So you've got three variables, two states. How many are we working with? 2 times 2 times 2? Working with 8. Okay, working with 8. Right? We know that now, because we're kind of working across. Now, let's try and imagine them in conflict with each other. Now, this is what your imagination will do. You'll start to say, what would happen if you, for example, took a situation where, and let me again find my place. Okay, right, there we go. Let's start with creativity. So let's kind of think it through. Creativity in antagonism, in conflict, would accuse generic skills, of prostituting the true creative urge to the highest bidder of the market. Right? And that's kind of something which you would say. And creativity would turn around to traditionalism and would say, hey, you're destroying the creative urge through routine and habit. Right? Generic skills, what would generic skills do? Well, generic skills would turn around to the single-minded creative urge and say, hey, you're being selfish and you're not being opportunistic enough, right? You're being too indulgent, you're being too self-obsessed. You're not taking advantage of current circumstances. It would accuse traditionalism of being naive, restrictive, inflexible, outdated. Traditionalism would accuse creativity, you can just imagine, overindulgence, chaos, disrespect, okay? And certainly would turn around to generic skills and would say, look, you're lacking substance. You know, you're lacking substance and backbone. You're not giving the traditions and the culture and the routine which is needed. But now let's try and imagine what would happen if the three were in alliance with each other. What would they say to each other if they tried to find places of working together? Well, creativity would argue that the generically skilled environment actually provides a genuine space for innovative energy to thrive, because you've got new projects all the time. And as you get new projects, you've got to use your creative impetus in all these new projects. Okay? It would involve inventive problem solving. Okay? And it would certainly open out to traditionalism. Okay? Creativity would open out to traditionalism and say, we actually need the routine as our backbone to become creative. A dancer only becomes really gifted in their dancing after, well, we know the 10,000 hour rule. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of routine to get to a point where you become an expert, to get to a point where you become innovative. Okay? True creativity in this alliance, they would say, true creativity would demand submission to a master-apprentice hierarchy. Okay? Now, the eyes of generic skills. Now we're thinking about generic skills trying to come into alliance with the other two. The eyes of generic skills would light up at creativity. And what they'd say is creativity, they'd say, that's one of the best generic skills. Okay? That's one of the most flexible of all skills. We've got to teach our kids creativity. And so we could continue. Okay? The combinatorial device would force you to think through the regulative spaces of alliance and conflict, which you would have to try and imagine just by following the device. Now, notice that in order to comparatively work with the three regulative spaces, we were also using the transformative device. We were taking one regulative principle, another regulative principle, and what would we do? We were looking for places where we could find similarities and places where we found antagonisms. And then, if you start to think about it, within each regulative discourse, within creativity, you've got a climbing device. You go from stages of being less creative to the highest levels of creativity. You go from a situation in tradition, where you go from being an apprentice, climbing the levels, to becoming a master. And what slowly starts to happen is you start to realize that these four devices spin a web. You use them together all the time. Okay? They kind of start to intersect and combine. And what happens is at a certain stage it just becomes a bit too much. Okay? And you kind of spin around. And I was going to use Dante, and I suppose Dante is my all-time favorite dude because he's the master of the imagination. So almost everything which I've done, I really take from Dante. And Dante gives an account where he he faints. When things get too much, he just passes out. Kind of gets up again and kind of starts. And I kind of want to stop at that point because I think we've got to a situation where we can kind of see the object I've been trying to focus on. See what I've been trying to point you to. See that you as educational experts should be working with your imaginations all the time. And when you do that, what I would hope you do is like the pilgrim. You break through to another world. And when you break through to that world, there's the everyday world. You break through into a world where you can see the levels. There they are. Okay. And you break through to a world where the competing principles, you try and work between the regulative principles. And you can see the world with the combinations between weak, solid, and open. What happens is, when you're in that world, what you do is you start to practice it. Because it's only through actually taking your own pedagogic imaginations through an apprenticeship into a masterly state, where eventually what happens is the whole world of education opens out for you. But it opens out for you in a way that you dance, in a way that you continually look for what's new and what's open, and what's creative in what was always already there. And hopefully this address would have just opened out for you the basic rules of operation of this very curious thing that forces you to be creative in your own area of specialization. Thanks.
Professor Hugo, thank you. My brain feels like it's been doing gymnastics for the last hour and a bit. Unfortunately, we don't have much time for questions, but we do have tea time, and we've got a dinner event this evening where you can interact and do some more gymnastics with Professor Hugo. Please join me in thanking him for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And this is just a small token of our